It's my pleasure to introduce Professor Matthew Hotopf, who is the Vice Dean of Research here at the IOPPN at King's College. He's also the Director of the Biomedical Research Centre, South London and Morsley, and his special interest is in the interaction between physical and mental health, and also to use modern technologies to enhance phenotyping for psychiatric disorders. The floor is all yours, Matthew. Thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, everything's perfect.
Right, okay. So thanks very much for the invitation and the opportunity to talk about the mental health phenotyping we've been doing in UK Biobank. I have a couple of disclaimers at the start of this. One is that I'm not a geneticist, and that'll become painfully obvious to you during this talk. I'm a clinician, psychiatrist, and an epidemiologist, and I'm approaching this talk from the point of view of looking at some of the pitfalls in terms of doing psychiatric phenotyping in a complex data set. So I'm not going to be showing so many genetic associations and so forth. I'm going to be showing some of the aspects of phenotyping I think are important and to bear in mind. And I'm really kind of thinking of this talk in terms of people who may come to use UK Biobank or are already doing so, and trying to get their head around the multitude of different ways in which you can look at psychiatric disorders within it. The second disclaimer is I'm not from UK Biobank. I've been a sort of associate and have been, I guess, sufficiently irritating to them to allow us to start doing mental health phenotyping within the cohort. The cohort's been going, I mean, there have been discussions about it for much of my professional life, and it was originally established for heart disease and cancer as the main phenotypes of interest. Mental health was not really considered as important. I think that's changed over time, and people have recognized the importance of mental health, not just as a disorder in its own right, or set of disorders in their own right, but also as the way in which they may interact and tell us about the biology of cardiometabolic disorders and so forth. So I'm going to, my disclosure is there. I basically run a large consortium which is done in partnership with industry, and I gain direct research funding from those companies. So what is UK Biobank? Well, I'm sure many of you will be very familiar with it. It's over 500,000 UK adults who were aged 40 to 69 at recruitment. And they had baseline data on a range of different lifestyle, environmental, personal, family, medical history, physical measures, and biological samples taken. So it was a very comprehensive attempt at getting a measure of health in midlife or late midlife. And the idea was to follow people over the next 20 years and look at incidence of those disorders I mentioned, heart disease, cancer, and other major killers in mid to late life. So that was the kind of motivation behind doing it, and it was established with 22 recruitment centres, recruitment taking place between 2006 and 2010. The recruitment centres were set up as kind of processing factories in UK cities, and the result was a large successful recruitment of participants. But it has to be borne in mind that these participants who were invited to take part via recruitment from their general practitioners, they were sent an invitation letter, and only around somewhat less than 10% of those who were invited actually ended up taking part. So it is not an epidemiological sort of cross-sectional study. It's not representative of the UK population. In fact, the gender difference is not as big as you might expect given that, but it definitely is a group of people who are less socioeconomically deprived than the UK average, and predominantly white, predominantly people in employment, and predominantly high educated. And when one looks at health data for this sample, there's less smoking and generally better physical health than you'd expect in the general population. So you go to an academic meeting in the UK, and provided there are enough people in their 50s, 60s, and 70s in the audience, and someone asks how many of you are UK Biobank participants, you will see a flurry of hands. It is recruiting people rather like me and a little bit older as many of the participants. So the baseline questionnaire took in a load of different measures, including sociodemographics and lifestyle, early life exposures, some measures of psychological state and functional cognitive function, a little bit on family history and medical history and general health. And the psychological state questions were essentially neuroticism, a very limited number of mood questions based on the PHQ family, but not the full PHQ mood questionnaire. And then serious life events and medical presentations for psychological symptoms, so simple questions about whether you'd ever seen a doctor for X, Y, or Z, and then some brief cognitive assessments, paired associated learning, and some reaction time tests. And that was the baseline. It also included the genomics, and that now is up there and available. A range of biomarkers, which I won't go in a huge amount of detail. Metabolomics is work currently in progress. And there's also a number of different measures of cardiac function, including pulse wave velocity and other similar measures done at baseline. So that was what we kind of started with and what one had, and there was already a series of enhancements going on within UK Biobank with a set of baseline assessments. So a proportion of people followed more vigorously with baseline assessments repeated. Also a number of people, about a fifth of the subjects, using wrist-worn accelerometers for about a week to measure physical activity, and there's been some very nice work looking at chronotype, for example, people like Danny Smith have been doing. There's been the assay panel I've mentioned already, but also multimodal imaging on 100,000 participants, which is not complete yet, but we're beginning to see some studies on the data released on that, on brain, cardiac, abdominal MRI, and 3D carotid ultrasound with repeat cognitive testing. And there's also been cardiac rhythm monitoring as sub-studies. So those enhancements have been very helpful, but they don't tell you a great deal about mental health other than the neuroimaging. But the record linkages are potentially very powerful. So there's a range of different data resources which are available in the UK, and the completed record linkages are cancer registrations and death registrations. And actually some mental disorder data does come in death registrations. It's sometimes mentioned as a as it were an incidental diagnosis on the death register. But most important is the hospital episode statistics. And this is a record of any hospital admission which takes place in public hospitals in the NHS. And it provides information about the timing of that admission, the duration of the admission, and the diagnosis or diagnoses of admission. So you get a primary diagnosis and a set of subsidiary diagnoses. And I'll come on to this in a bit in terms of how reliable those diagnoses actually are. But in the UK, as in most places, most mental health care does not take place in hospital. And we have a comprehensive system of primary care, and GP records have now been linked to some extent for UK Biobank. The GP records are complete for Scotland and Wales for all sorts of complex reasons. They're not less complete for England, but we have about 45% of the total participants' GP records now linked to UK Biobank, and that was released earlier last year. And the work is still in progress to get that up to 100%. There's also the mental health minimum data set, which is work in progress, but that provides information about people who are seeing secondary care mental health services in the community, and also IAPT, which is the Improving Access to Psychological Therapy service, a nationwide service providing cognitive behavior therapy and similar structured brief therapies for people with anxiety and depressive disorders. So that again is work in progress as a linkage. And then the second bit where you get more information about mental health has been questionnaires, web-based questionnaires sent out to participants. We have a list of the questionnaires which have already been completed. Mental health was one of those. And then a set of planned questionnaires which are upcoming. There's one due, which I haven't been involved in the development of, for neurodevelopmental disorders, primarily ADHD and autism spectrum disorders, which was scheduled to be run in 2020. With COVID, it will almost certainly be delayed till next year. But those are the measures which are being proposed for that questionnaire. And then there is a repeat of the mental health questionnaire with some differences, which is planned beyond that. And we don't know exactly when that will go out, but it has been through the processes, and we're ready to roll effectively in terms of having the questionnaire designed. So I just want to take a pause at this point and think about what are the issues for mental health phenotyping when you're looking at a big data set like UK Biobank. How does one have to think about it? And the first one, I guess, is that in a sense, you're dealing with disorders which have their onsets in adolescence and early adult life, and of course for neurodevelopmental disorders, even before that. And yet we're looking at adults in their now in their late 50s, 60s and 70s. Secondly, the disorders fluctuate over time. We of course all know this, but if you have a history of anxiety or depression, it waxes and wanes over a life course. And I'm going to talk a bit more about what that might lead to in terms of how the phenotyping looks a bit further on. Of course, some disorders are inherently difficult to identify by questionnaire, or at least have tended to be thought that way, particularly psychotic disorders. There's issues about validity of healthcare data, health record data, which I'll come on to in a moment. There's issues about, I guess, people, we know of mental disorders as being multiple disorders and multiple exposures. So there's potentially just as much information on the mental health side required as on the physical health side. Stigma, well, there's always stigma, isn't there? And I guess what's interesting was trying to persuade my colleagues that doing a mental health questionnaire would be a good idea was initially quite difficult. And there was some challenge, I guess, in terms of people won't like this, people won't like the sorts of questions which are being asked and so on. And we took a lot of time and effort to make sure we piloted this. We put the questions in front of people with mental health problems and checked that they weren't going to be offended or upset by them. And actually, as again I'll show, the data indicate that that was highly acceptable. And last point, and I think Joel picked up on this a bit in the previous talk, is around participation rate and acceptance and representativeness of people with mental disorders. We know from other surveys that people with mental disorders, particularly people with more chaotic disorders which lead to more chaotic behaviors, for example, substance use disorders or psychosis, are much, much less likely to participate in general population studies. And that will be amplified by the fact that there's a low participation rate in UK Biobank anyway. So those were some of the issues we were facing. And I guess what we did was try and establish a mental health working group, which first met in January 2015. And since then, there's been a sort of regular meeting of that group trying to define questionnaires and deal with the issues of phenotyping as we've gone forward. And as you'd expect, it's been a pretty iterative process, lots of consultation, but we ended up rolling out the first questionnaire in 2016 with that repeated questionnaire now agreed. The strategy for phenotyping is really a combination of record linkage with the web-based interview. And the emphasis for the more severe and rarer disorders like psychosis and bipolar disorder is, I guess, more of an emphasis on the record linkage. And for the common disorders, more of an emphasis on the web-based survey. but actually in all cases a combination. And I think the point I want to make most strongly is that there's all sorts of different ways in which one can actually cut the cake and end up making the diagnostic rules up. What's, I think, absolutely critical is that when you're doing this and using these data, you have a clear sense of how you've done it, and there's transparency about that, and you build in sensitivity analyses into your protocol and try and pre-publish all of that, so that there isn't too much toing and froing in terms of harking and so on with the use of these data. So this is what the questionnaire looked like, fairly standard sort of web-based questionnaire. This is the results in terms of the participation. It was quite remarkable seeing these data come in over about a month, and most of the responses were back within a month. We actually carried on for quite a bit longer, and it's still open actually to participants. So there are people who, the numbers keep going up somewhat, so people can complete this as they go. But the key thing is to look here, the numbers of just over 150,000, in fact, a 46% participation rate from the people we had email addresses on. And we had, of those people who did the questionnaire, we had just one complaint of a participant who had, I think, been stirred up by some of the questions we were asking. There were quite a few comments. Many of our participants are people with a background in academia, and people telling us how poorly designed psychiatric questionnaires were, etc. But there was nothing much we could do about that, because we were trying to use standardized questionnaires. One genomic study, I guess, from Mark Adams and colleagues, showing that actually there were genes associated with adherence to taking part in the questionnaire. So actually loci identified with email contact and completing the health survey. And also positive genetic correlations of higher educational attainment, better health, negatively genetically correlated with psychological distress and schizophrenia. So again, a reminder that one has these potential effects in studies of this nature. So when one looks at this, what were the frequencies? I'm just going to show this. I think actually because it's quite interesting that despite all the problems I've been going on about in terms of representativeness, our data suggested actually that in terms of self-reported disorders, the participants were not that different from a proper probability sampled survey, the health survey for England. And you'll see here the prevalence figures for UK Biobank. I try and avoid saying prevalence because it implies that it's a population study. But the frequency of these disorders in UK Biobank participants compared to the frequency of the same disorders asked about more or less the same way in the health survey for England. And actually the only difference in terms of the confidence intervals here not overlapping with the estimate here was alcohol and drug addiction, where we found a higher prevalence of people with those disorders in UK Biobank. Still probably a massive underestimate. So what questionnaires did we use, and what are we planning to use in the second mental health questionnaire? I should just preface this by saying that what we're expecting with the second mental health questionnaire is quite a lot of people who have done it. Quite a lot of people who are participants in UK Biobank who didn't complete it the first time round may well answer it the second time round. So in fact, there's a lot of repetition between what we did the first time and the second time, because we want to capture as many people with the standard measures as possible. So there will be the lifetime screening questionnaires about a range of different disorders. There'll be measures of family history, which is new, current depression on PHQ, the CIDI short form, lifetime depression, again repeated, a question on antidepressant therapy and response, which will be new, to look at people who've had problems with treatment resistance, lifetime manic symptoms, current anxiety symptoms, a panic module from the CIDI, eating disorders adapted from the PGC eating disorders group questionnaire, not quite as long, but many similar items, alcohol, the audit, cannabis use, psychotic experiences, and so on. And I won't hark on through them all, you can see them. So that's the questionnaire, and that's the sort of update on where we're at with those questionnaires. It will be helpful, I guess, to be able to see some indications of persistence of symptoms and syndromes between the two periods of the time in these two questionnaires. And we hope that it'll increase the numbers, because there'll be people who've now got email addresses, for example, who didn't previously, and people who are inclined to participate who ignored their emails last time. So another set of questions which I want to raise, and this is work, in fact, all of this is work which my colleague Katrina Davis has been really driving and been incredibly energetic in making it all happen. What I want to describe is some of the data, some of the work we've been doing on admissions, because if we're going to use the hospital episode statistics, are we absolutely confident that that data from health records is actually correct? You're using administrative data. There are all sorts of reasons why that administrative data might be problematic. So we have conducted a systematic review, and this looked at all studies where there was a comparison between administrative data and some kind of reference standard, which typically would have been a diagnostic interview. And what you see on this chart is that actually most of the time for most administrative data, you can get a pretty good positive predictive value. In other words, people who've got this label on their hospital records probably do actually have the disorder, as we'd recognize it with research grade interviews. And that certainly applies for psychotic disorders and schizophrenia right at the top there. It applies perhaps less robustly for affective disorders, but still pretty well. Much less robustly for anxiety disorder and substance use disorders. And I think the point here is that a lot of the people, they're often a somewhat atypical group who actually get admitted, I guess, and it's fairly rare that anxiety disorders are primary, a primary cause for admission. We then did our own check to make sure that this actually worked for UK hospital data, and essentially what we were looking at was whether if you took a specific admission and you looked at the hospital episode statistics data for that admission, and then you went back to the record and looked in depth at the record and did a diagnostic interview using the case note review, whether you'd actually reached the same details for this. And what you found, actually the same diagnosis for it. And what we found on the middle column here was that actually for the specific episode, there was often quite a lot of noise in the system, and the positive predictive value wasn't very high. In other words, your diagnosis for that specific episode was not necessarily congruent with what a blinded psychiatrist looking through the notes, thinking what's going on in that episode, would have given us the diagnosis. However, when that was compared with that same psychiatrist's lifetime diagnosis going through the entire record, the positive predictive values were actually very good. So again, it indicates that there is a degree of noise, but actually for most of the time, particularly for disorders like schizophrenia, you have pretty good, you can be pretty confident that actually the disorders were good. Now, there is a caveat here, and anyone using UK Biobank data should recognize this, and that is that we're looking at primary diagnosis for mental health admissions, but actually HES, the hospital episode statistics, does include the secondary diagnoses, which will include mental health disorders in people who've been admitted to general hospitals. And in those, we suspect that the diagnoses are far less reliable. So if you want to maximize specificity over sensitivity, make sure you use the primary diagnosis for mental health admissions. Okay, now we're getting to the point where the UK Biobank team have started to apply outcome adjudication to get disorders, for example, like schizophrenia, for UK Biobank, and the work in progress is now for the common mental disorders, but we're doing it, it's already been completed for the for psychotic disorders. And what you see here is the data dictionary, and it will show you the source of information which has gone to actually determine whether someone likely has schizophrenia. So these are the people who've got a schizophrenia diagnosis. And what you can see here is that some of them have come from primary care only. In fact, 2 of them came from the death register only. Some came from primary care only. Some have come from hospital data, admissions only. Some have come from staff report only. And then many of them are in different combinations of data sources. We've done something similar in depression just to emphasize this, that if you can put together hospital diagnoses, self-report, and the CIDI, and you get nearly 50,000 people who have a lifetime diagnosis of depression. But actually, what you see in the Venn diagram is that quite a lot of these categories are unique, so that actually people who meet criteria on the CIDI, about 32% of the sample of that 48,000 met it only on the CIDI alone, and only 4% of the entire sample meet all 3. So the vast majority of the self-report and the CIDI categories, relatively few people get hospitalized. When we've got the primary care records, we'll end up with a 4th blob, a sort of 4-dimensional, a 3-dimensional Venn diagram, but it will no doubt lead to a lot more uncertainty about which definition was being used to define the outcome. Now, this shouldn't surprise us and it shouldn't frighten us, but it's just a question of transparency about how you use the data and how you report it. So I've made up a case, as it were, on the top line here. Imagine someone who is having episodes of depression or anxiety and has their first episode at the age of 15, sees their GP, who doesn't give a diagnosis but might send them home with sleeping pills. And then in their 20s and age 20 and 25, they have longer episodes, get hospitalized for self-harm, maybe have a period of treatment-resistant depression. And then following a life event, another episode in their 30s, and then relative stability in later life. That bit may be a little bit over-optimistic, but this is not unusual to see in a sort of life course of someone with a mental disorder. So when we're looking at their data in UK Biobank, you've got these different sources of information, including self-report. And when you're asking them at the age of 60 about a lifetime history, it's remarkable how many people forget what went on in their life or choose not to tell you. And we shouldn't be too surprised by that. Similarly, the CIDI, which asks the questions about specific symptom complexes, again, there are all sorts of reasons why people may not be able to remember what happened in their mid-20s when they're asking in their 60s. The hospitalization data may well not pick up someone who's had a hospitalization in their 20s because the data didn't exist, it wasn't digitized and available until the mid-1990s. And the GP data may well be lacking, or there may be periods of time when the GP data was absent. So the take home, I guess, is that we have a complex range of different ways of getting an insight into these disorders. And I think there's quite an art to be able to describe this and work through how you make sense of it. It's worth just returning to a very old, but I think useful formulation given by Goldberg and Huxley in 1980 of the way in which you can see sort of filters between different levels of care. So if you take our patient in the community, our biobank respondents, mental health questionnaire will pick up morbidity in the community. They have to get through 2 filters before they actually get a primary care diagnosis of conspicuous morbidity, of a diagnosis of anxiety or depression or something else. And not everyone makes it through that filter who actually has the disorder. And then the hospital inpatients are a vanishingly rare component, and that number will be much smaller now than it was in the 1980s. And those are the ones picked up in hospital episode statistics admissions data. So just to summarize, and I want to be just finish on this point. I think if it's not too sort of pessimistic and postmodern as a final point, there is no ground truth. I don't think there's any particular there's no particular kind of measure of mental disorder which trumps any other measure. I think all of them have their problems, and they basically, we're seeing different facets of reality, and you have to kind of build up a story from the information you have. I think it's important also, if you're doing GWAS studies, that you don't necessarily assume your controls are truly unaffected. We have tried to build in questions along the lines of, have you ever had any problems ever in your life, into those screening questions. So it's not just a positive endorsement of individual disorders, but it is perfectly possible, as I was showing in that sort of mocked up example, that people will have been affected, but not reported as such. I think there's a question here really about open science and transparency. And so, you know, the decisions you take on defining outcomes will impact your results. And I think building sensitivity analyses into protocols is really critical. Try to be explicit as possible in describing the outcomes and publish your code. Remember, I think, the sample being highly enriched for certain trays. I think basically UK Biobank is a group of people who, by and large, educated and have high pro-social trays, and those characteristics may shine through in some of the analyses. So you just need to keep aware of that potential bias which comes through. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Matthew. It was amazing. There are a few questions in the Q&A, and I would just start reading out some to you. So the first one is, are you aware if the UK Biobank is trying to increase the diversity of the sample?
No, I'm not aware, and I don't think it's happening. And the reason is that it's it is a cohort which was established at a certain point in time. It's not a rolling kind of bioresource, and it is, it is a weakness of UK Biobank. I think ideally one would have an oversampling, a deliberate oversampling of people of African ancestry, very much along the lines that Joel was describing before. But it is, and other ethnicities, of course. It is a challenge.
And the next question is, could you tell us some more about the mental health working group? Who is involved and what roles do they have?
Well, it's a coalition of the willing. And I think if people wanted to send me an email and say they'd like to be involved, they would be very welcome. We sent out something, I mean, it was a fairly British coalition of the willing, I guess. We sent out a list to a number of different people we knew were interested in the field, and asked to snowball, and went to heads of departments of psychology and psychiatry around the country. We ended up with about 50 people in the first instance, and then it gradually sort of found its way into a smaller coalition. So we have, for example, Andrew McIntosh in Edinburgh, Danny Smith in Glasgow, and John in Swansea. And I don't have the list, I don't have the full list to hand, but I can provide that for anyone who's interested. I should, of course, have had my collaborators up as an acknowledgement, and I apologize for that.
I've got another question from Abraham Palmer. So how should people in the audience, if they are interested, submit suggestions for additional phenotypes to collect?
That's a good question. I mean, I think that there are two routes. One is to go directly to UK Biobank, and if you go to the website, send an email to the leaders of UK Biobank, asking for additional measures. That's actually what happened with the neurodevelopmental questionnaire. It just went ahead, and we found out about it a bit later. So we were much more sort of focused on anxiety, depression, and trying to do the kind of major mental disorders of later life. If you can also, I mean, by all means, send me a message, and I'll do my best to do what we can. I think it's quite hard persuading, for obvious reasons. UK Biobank have got all sorts of requests from many different people in a very wide academic community, all wanting their measures in. So it is kind of really important. There has to be a sort of channel to be able to prioritize.
And then two additional questions, which I maybe can make one of. Do you know when the mental health question number 2 will be available, when the data will be available, or when it will be sent out? And is there a plan to include like data from the UK justice system?
So I don't know when the questionnaire will go out, and I think we were being told it would be sometime towards the end of 21 or beginning of 22. I think it may well be a bit later because of COVID. I hope not much later. We have got our act together, and I think there are other people in the pipeline who may be quite less evolved, so we may be able to bump up the queue a little bit. But it's basically, there's a lot of demand, and there's a lot of concern about participant fatigue. In terms of, I know of no plans to link with criminal justice data. It would be wonderful to do that. I think there may be challenges in terms of participant acceptability because of the nature of UK Biobank. There is, the team are in contact with participants, so you wouldn't be able, under data protection law, to make a linkage on the basis of not being able to make contact with participants. So you'd have to actually gain explicit consent. And I suspect that the team, I don't know this for sure, but I suspect the team may be rather cautious about asking them for such sensitive data in a sample which has effectively been recruited for largely, well, for health reasons.